What if the most damaging royal moments weren't the grand battles or famous betrayals, but the small, stubborn, embarrassingly human decisions that everyone around the throne could see were a bad idea? What if divine right sometimes meant divine immunity from common sense? Tonight we're counting down the British royals who most spectacularly misunderstood their own power, mistook flattery for advice, and treated consequences like a problem for somebody else. This isn't a cheap dunk on the past. We'll lean on court records, parliamentary disputes, diplomatic reports, and the kind of contemporary gossip that keeps repeating because it left fingerprints in real policy. You'll hear dates, names, sums of money, and the quiet aftermath, ruined reputations, lost territories, unnecessary wars, and families shredded for pride. If you like long, calm stories with sharp edges, tap like, subscribe, and settle in. Dim the lights, loosen your jaw, and let's begin our slow walk down the corridor where bad decisions echo the loudest. Rank 35, Henry I and the Lamprey Lesson. In late November 1135, King Henry I is old by medieval standards, hard-edged and still clinging to control like a man gripping a slippery rope over a deep well. He's in Normandy, at Lyon-la-Forêt, and he does something so quietly avoidable that it almost feels like the universe testing the concept of royalty. Contemporary chroniclers say Henry ate lampreys, rich, fashionable, and notoriously heavy, despite warnings. Whether it was lampreys specifically or simply a reckless feast when his body was already compromised, either story survives because it fits the pattern people recognized: the king who refused limits. He falls ill soon after, and on December 1st, 1135, he's dead. Now here's the self-sabotage. Henry wasn't just a man. He was a system. His death without a smoothly accepted successor lit a fuse under a succession crisis. He had named his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as heir, and the political class had sworn oaths, yet within weeks Stephen of Blois is taking the crown in England, and the long civil conflict later called the Anarchy begins. Plenty of monarchs died. Not all of them died in a way that handed their realm a chaos coupon. And speaking of avoidable chaos, wait until you hear what happens when a king goes hunting with a court full of people who might benefit from him not coming back. Rank 34, William II and the Arrow-Friendly Hunt. On August 2nd, 1100, William II, William Rufus, rides into the New Forest to hunt. The setting is almost too neat. A king in a landscape already haunted by family tragedy, a tight circle of noble companions, and the kind of leisure that medieval rulers used as both sport and soft power. By evening, William is dead, killed by an arrow. The official version points to a hunting accident, often associated with Walter Tyrrell, but even contemporaries noticed how convenient the timing felt. William has no legitimate children. His younger brother Henry is nearby, and Henry moves with the brisk efficiency of someone who has mentally rehearsed this moment. Henry rides to Winchester, secures the royal treasury, and is crowned Henry I within days. We can't prove murder from a distance of 9 centuries, and the evidence is the shape of the aftermath, the speed, the readiness, the way the political machine pivots as if the pivot was already greased. But here's why William earns his place on this list. Even if it truly was an accident, he placed himself in the perfect conditions for a tragic misunderstanding. The New Forest wasn't a harmless playground. It was politically charged land, carved out at enormous social cost by his father, William the Conqueror, and resented by locals. A king who believed he could live above the resentments he'd inherited was betting his life against the law of probability and against the ambitions of the men holding weapons around him. If Henry I's mistake was treating his body like it couldn't veto his plans, William II's was treating risk like it couldn't find him. Meanwhile, a much later royal will make a different kind of gamble, not with arrows, but with attention, thinking popularity could substitute for judgment. Rank 33, George IV and the debt as a lifestyle. Before he's George IV, he's the Prince of Wales, and by the 1780s and 1790s he is an astonishing monument to the idea that consequences are optional if your father is king. George lives like a man trying to purchase love in installments. Palaces, decor, clothes, parties, art, horses, food, and the endless human furniture of high society. His spending becomes public policy because Parliament ends up dragged into the mess. When a royal piles up debts, it's never just personal embarrassment. It becomes a national argument about money, morality, and control. Her official debates and contemporary commentary make clear the scale. Debts in the hundreds of thousands of pounds at a time when that kind of money could fund fleets, fortresses, and entire administrative systems. And the solution is rarely reform. It's a bailout with conditions, followed by new spending, followed by another bailout, followed by fresh public outrage. His private life becomes its own slow-motion disaster. Secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, a later politically arranged marriage that collapses almost immediately, and a long trail of scandal that turns the monarchy into something people discuss the way they discuss a badly run theatre. Here's the comparative sting. Plenty of royals spend lavishly. George makes it structural. He turns indulgence into routine governance, and training the public to see the crown as a siphon rather than a symbol. And speaking of royals who confused personal desire with national stability, wait until we reach the man who looked at a constitutional monarchy and decided it was the perfect stage for a romantic ultimatum. Rank 32, Edward VIII, and the abdication gamble. In 1936, the British monarchy is meant to look modern, stable, and quietly inevitable, like a building you assume will still be there when you're old. Then Edward VIII becomes king, and within the year he decides to put the entire structure on the negotiating table. His insistence on marrying Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee in the middle of an era when that fact had political and religious weight, creates a crisis that isn't just tabloid drama. The monarch is head of the Church of England. The government has to consider public confidence, dominion politics, and constitutional precedent. The private turns national in a way that makes everyone in power feel their teeth grind. Edward's miscalculation is almost childlike. He treats the system as if it exists to accommodate him rather than to contain him. He imagines he can force a compromise, that popularity will bend ministers, that charm can defeat constitutional reality. Instead, he abdicates on the 11th of December 1936. The fallout is profound. His brother becomes George VI, an unexpected king, carrying the crown into the Second World War with a sense of duty that Edward seemed to find personally inconvenient. Edward becomes Duke of Windsor, a living reminder that monarchy can wobble on the hinge of one person's stubbornness. And yes, there are later controversies, and including political naivete and questionable associations that historians continue to argue over. But even without the arguments, the core remains. He mistook a crown for a personal accessory. If you think that was self-inflicted, keep your eyes half closed. We're still in the shallow end. Rank 31. Mary, Queen of Scots, and the husband problem. Mary, Queen of Scots, is intelligent, charismatic, and raised amid the high-wire politics of France and Scotland, which makes her worst decisions feel even more like a tragedy you can see forming in the distance. In 1565, she marries Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He is handsome, vain, politically ambitious, and, crucially, possesses a claim to the English throne that makes the match look strategically tempting. It also makes him radioactive. The marriage quickly curdles. Contemporary accounts describe Darnley's behaviour as erratic and demanding. In 1566, Mary's secretary David Rizzio is murdered in a brutal attack involving nobles and, according to many reports, Darnley's complicity. Mary survives. She gives birth to a son, James, in June 1566. Then, in February 1567, Darnley dies in an explosion at Kirk O'Field, found dead nearby, an event so suspicious that it stains the era. The evidence points in multiple directions and historians argue details, but the political stench is undeniable. Mary's next move is where the word avoidable starts flashing like a warning lantern. Within months, she marries James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a man widely suspected of involvement in Darnley's death. Whether Mary was coerced, manipulated, or acting under a warped sense of necessity is debated. What's not debated is the result. Scottish nobles revolt. Mary is forced to abdicate in July 1567, and her life turns into flight, imprisonment, and eventual execution in England in 1587. Brilliant people can make catastrophically bad choices when they confuse urgency with destiny. And speaking of destiny, let's visit a king who thought principles were more important than compromise, even when compromise was the only thing standing between him and civil war. Rank 30, Charles I and the pride that paid in blood. Charles I is the sort of ruler who makes you understand why people invented the phrase unforced error. He believes deeply in royal authority, in the sanctity of his position, and in the idea that yielding sets a precedent that will swallow the crown whole. In 1629, after clashes with Parliament, he chooses personal rule, governing without Parliament, lasting until 1640. On paper, it sounds decisive. In reality, it's a slow accumulation of resentment. He raises money through controversial means like ship money, pushing legal boundaries and public patience. Religious policy under his rule and under the influence of figures like Archbishop William Laud intensifies fears of popery and authoritarianism. Then comes the moment where his stubbornness meets the physics of a multi-kingdom monarchy. Attempts to impose religious changes in Scotland help spark the bishops' wars. Charles is forced to call Parliament again because war costs money and principle doesn't print currency. From there, the slide is brutal. Polarization, mistrust, armed conflict. The English civil wars begin in 1642. Charles loses, is captured. Hire negotiates as if time is on his side and appears to many contemporaries to treat agreements as temporary inconveniences. On 30 January 1649, he is executed. Here's the comparative element. Other monarchs faced parliamentary constraints and learned the art of bending without breaking. Charles treats bending as humiliation. He turns governance into a contest of wills against a political class that has learned to organize, fund, and fight. If Edward VIII gambled the crown for love, Charles gambled it for a concept of authority so rigid it snapped. But the monarchy's capacity for self-sabotage doesn't end there. Sometimes it arrives dressed as certainty and determined to convert a whole country by force of personality. To rank 29, James II and the moment he stopped listening. James II comes to the throne in 1685 with experience, military command, political scars, and a clear religious identity as a Catholic in a predominantly Protestant kingdom. That identity is not automatically a death sentence. The disaster is how he handles it. He pushes policies that many subjects interpret as an attempt to reshape the religious settlement without consent. He promotes Catholics to key positions, leans on royal prerogative, and issues the Declaration of Indulgence in 1687, attempting to suspend penal laws and grant broad religious toleration by royal authority rather than parliamentary process. Toleration sounds benevolent. The method sounds like absolutism. In 1688, the trial of the 7 bishops, charged after petitioning against the declaration, becomes a public spectacle. Their acquittal is read as a rejection of James's approach. Then the birth of James's son in June 1688 transforms anxiety into panic. People who might have tolerated a Catholic king now fear a Catholic dynasty. Political elites invite William of Orange to intervene. William lands in England in November 1688. James's support collapses. By December, James flees. The glorious revolution follows, with William and Mary taking the throne and a new constitutional settlement reshaping royal power. James didn't lose his crown because he was Catholic. He lost it because he refused to understand the limits of a monarchy that had evolved beyond his imagination. And speaking of monarchs who couldn't quit their favourites, let's step back to a king who learned, too late, that affection at court can turn into a weapon in the hands of your enemies. Rank 28. Edward II and the favourite-shaped trap. Edward II becomes king in 1307, and from the beginning he seems less interested in ruling than in insisting that his personal preferences should be treated as national priorities. His relationship with Piers Gaveston is the first flashpoint. Gaveston is elevated, showered with titles and attention, and, according to contemporary criticism, allowed to mock powerful nobles. Whether the bond is romantic, political, or simply an intense friendship doesn't change the political math. Edward makes his favourite a lightning rod, then stands under the lightning with him. Baronial opposition grows. Gaveston is captured and executed in 1312. Edward doesn't learn. Later, the Despencer family rises into the same role, generating the same rage. Meanwhile, England suffers humiliations, including the crushing defeat at Bannockburn in 1314 against Robert the Bruce's Scots, a disaster that exposes weaknesses in leadership and logistics. The self-sabotage reaches its peak in the 1320s. Edward's marriage to Isabella of France collapses into open political warfare. Isabella aligns with Roger Mortimer, returns with an invading force in 1326, and Edward's support evaporates like fog under sunlight. He is deposed in January 1327. He dies later that year in custody, surrounded by stories, some likely exaggerated, about the manner of his end. The details are contested, but his fall is not. Compared to rulers who used favourites discreetly, Edward turns favouritism into a banner, daring the realm to challenge him. And if you're noticing a pattern, royal certainty meeting political reality, keep that thought. Next, we meet a king whose talent wasn't tyranny or charm, but a rare, almost artistic ability to make every problem worse. Rank 27, King John, and the talent for making it worse. John becomes king in 1199, and by the time he dies in 1216, his reign has turned into a cautionary tale so influential that it still echoes in constitutional mythology. One core catastrophe, the loss of Normandy in 1204. John's father, Henry II, and brother, Richard I, had held vast lands in France. Under John, much of it collapses under the pressure of French King Philip II's strategy and John's own political missteps, alienating key allies, mishandling feudal obligations, and failing to project reliable authority across the Channel. But John doesn't merely lose territory, he responds in ways that compound distrust. He squeezes barons financially, uses harsh legal tactics, and treats loyalty as something you can demand rather than earn. Contemporary chroniclers and administrative records paint a picture of relentless extraction and suspicion. By 1215, rebellion is open. John is forced into sealing Magna Carta at Runnymede in June, a document that becomes famous not because it instantly created liberty, but because it was a negotiated admission that the king could not govern by appetite alone. Then John seeks annulment, war resumes, and the kingdom invites Prince Louis of France to take the English throne. It is hard to overstate how dire that is. The political class would rather gamble on a foreign prince than trust their own king. John dies in October 1216, leaving a child king, Henry III, and a country trying to stitch itself back together. Other royals will do foolish things. John does foolish things in bulk. And speaking of bulk, wait until you see what happens when a young king decides revenge is governance and fear is a perfectly acceptable budget line. Rank 26. Richard II and the revenge becomes policy. Richard II inherits the English throne in 1377 as a child and grows up inside a court that teaches him two dangerous lessons: that majesty must be performed and that threats must be crushed, not managed. He survives the peasants' revolt in 1381, an event that marks him early and seems to harden his sense that order is something you impose from above. As he matures, he increasingly relies on a tight circle of favourites and asserts a vision of kingship that alarms the political elite. The real self-sabotage crescendo comes in the late 1390s. After years of tension with powerful nobles, Richard moves toward what looks, to many contemporaries, like a revenge program disguised as justice. In 1397, he targets former opponents, arrests, executions, exiles, using the machinery of law with a personal edge sharp enough to draw blood. It's the kind of strategy that can work if you're overwhelmingly feared and undeniably secure. Richard is neither. In 1399, John of Gaunt dies and Richard seizes Gaunt's estates, effectively disinheriting Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke. That is not merely cruel. It signals that property and inheritance are unsafe when they sit near the crown's hunger. Bolingbroke returns from exile while Richard is away in Ireland. Support coalesces around him with astonishing speed. Richard is captured, forced to abdicate, and Henry becomes Henry IV. Richard dies in 1400, likely in captivity, the exact circumstances still debated. Compared to kings who understood that nobility is a balancing act, Richard treats the political class like furniture, something you can rearrange without it toppling on you. And that's the first stretch of our countdown, only the first stretch, because from here, the decisions get louder, the warning signs get clearer, and the cost gets harder to ignore. Rank 25, Henry VI, and the throne without the grip. Henry VI becomes King of England in 1422 when he's still an infant, inheriting not just a crown, but a war in France that is already expensive, politically delicate, and easy to lose if you blink at the wrong moment. When he grows up, the problem isn't that he lacks piety or good intentions, it's that he seems to believe intentions can substitute for control. By the 1440s and 1450s, English holdings in France are collapsing. The political argument at home becomes poisonous. Who betrayed the war effort? Who profited? Who failed? Who lied? Henry's court becomes a battlefield of factions, and he responds like a man trying to calm a storm by politely asking it to stop. The stupid part isn't simply weakness, it's the repeated refusal to recognize that a monarchy is also an executive office. Patronage must be managed, rivals contained, finances stabilized, and military strategy made coherent. Instead, Henry allows favourites and competing power blocks to harden into something like rival governments. When crisis hits hardest, especially during periods when Henry's capacity to govern is impaired, there is no resilient system around him, only hungry competitors. The result is not a single bad year. It's a national unravelling that feeds directly into the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict that turns who should advise the king into who gets to be king. Compared to rulers who were ruthless just to survive, Henry is almost tragically gentle. And speaking of gentle decisions with violent consequences, let's meet the young king who tried to rewrite succession like it was a personal note he could fold into a pocket. Rank 24, Edward VI, then the succession. He tried to redraft Edward VI as intelligent, educated, iron sickly, raised inside a political world where theology and power are welded together. By the time he's king, England is mid-transformation, and everyone knows the succession will determine whether that transformation continues or snaps back. As Edward's health fails in 1553, he supports a plan often associated with his devise for the succession, aiming to bypass his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth in favour of Lady Jane Grey. The motivations are not mysterious: religious anxiety, political control, and the desire to keep policy in familiar hands. The mistake is assuming the realm will treat a contrived paper solution as more legitimate than the Tudor bloodline everyone recognises. Jane is proclaimed queen, but support for Mary swells rapidly. Mary's claim has emotional force, legal gravity, and, crucially, momentum. Jane's reign collapses in days, and the fallout is grim. Jane is executed, as are others entangled in the plot, and the country absorbs yet another lesson in how quickly elite schemes can turn into public bloodshed. Edward's defenders argue he was manipulated by powerful men, and he was young. That's true. But the act still matters because it reveals a particularly royal form of miscalculation, believing that legality is whatever the palace writes down, and legitimacy is whatever the court announces. Compared to monarchs who secured succession through broad consensus, Edward's last political act detonates a crisis. Meanwhile, the queen who follows will make a different kind of gamble, one that treats marriage as policy, and policy as something love can stabilize. The rank 23, Mary the First and the marriage that made England feel second. Mary the First inherits a kingdom split by religious upheaval and exhausted by sharp turns in policy. She is determined, politically serious, and absolutely convinced she must restore the Catholic faith. That alone guarantees conflict. But her most self-defeating decision is how she tries to anchor her reign. In 1554, Mary marries Philip of Spain, later Philip II. On paper, it's a power match: international prestige, Catholic unity, security. In practice, it triggers deep fear. England as a junior partner in a Habsburg empire, English interests sacrificed to continental strategy, and a queen whose legitimacy is seen as tethered to a foreign husband. The marriage terms attempt to limit Philip's power in England. But public perception doesn't read fine print when anxiety is already loud. Wyatt's rebellion erupts in early 1554, fueled by precisely these fears. Even after it fails, suspicion remains baked into the reign. Then comes the cruel punctuation. Mary's phantom pregnancies, documented by contemporaries, humiliate the court and magnify uncertainty. No heir arrives to secure her religious program, and in 1558 England loses Calais, its last significant foothold in France, a symbolic blow that feels like history slamming a door. Mary's reputation is also shaped by the Marian persecutions of Protestants, which become propaganda fuel for generations. But even in purely political terms, the marriage decision is a classic misread. She thought alliance would strengthen her. Instead, it made her seem less English precisely when she needed to be unmistakably sovereign. And speaking of sovereigns who didn't grasp what people would tolerate, let's go back to a king whose idea of peace was to buy it with everyone else's money. Rank 22. Richard I and the kingdom he treated like a wallet. Richard I is remembered as the warrior king, the crusader, the lion-hearted symbol of medieval glamour. The problem with glamour is that it often builds the future. Richard spends remarkably little time in England after becoming king in 1189. He's abroad on crusade, in conflict, in diplomacy, in captivity, living the life of a martial celebrity in an age when celebrity is purchased with taxes. England funds Richard's ambitions through heavy financial extraction, selling offices, raising scutage, so squeezing the administrative system until it produces coin. When Richard is captured on his way back from crusade, the ransom demanded is enormous, and the effort to raise it is nationally bruising. Here's the comparative element. Some kings exploit their realms to build lasting institutions or secure long-term stability. Richard exploits his realm to be Richard. In his absence, domestic politics churn. John, his brother, maneuvers. Ministers and regents struggle to maintain order. The machinery holds barely, but it holds under strain that will matter later, because a strained system inherits brittleness. Richard's defenders argue he brought prestige and military skill. True, yet the strategic payoff for England is questionable compared to the cost. When he dies in 1199, the kingdom is left with debts, resentments, and a succession that hands power to John, the very man least equipped to handle a fragile inheritance. Richard doesn't ruin England in one dramatic blunder. He normalizes the idea that the kingdom exists to bankroll a king's personal saga. And speaking of personal sagas, let's meet a monarch who turned the court into a stage, then seemed surprised when the audience began throwing things. Rank 21. James I and the favourites who ran up the bill. James I arrives in England in 1603, inheriting a relatively stable kingdom and offering, at first, the promise of continuity. He is learned, witty, and deeply convinced of monarchy's sacred nature. But he carries a habit that becomes politically expensive, the elevation of favourites in ways that feel both intimate and financially reckless. Courtiers always scramble for access. There James turns access into a flood. Men like Robert Carr and George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, rise spectacularly, gaining influence, wealth, titles and public attention. The problem isn't simply that James liked them, it's that he lets favouritism become a substitute for disciplined governance. Meanwhile, royal finances deteriorate. The crown is chronically short of money, Parliament is wary, and James's court spending becomes a symbol of softness and indulgence. Every time he asks for funds, he's negotiating from a weaker position, because critics can point to waste and demand reform. Politically, James also misreads the mood around religion and unity. The gunpowder plot in 1605 is a trauma that hardens sectarian attitudes. James's preference for rhetorical balancing acts can look, to critics, like indecision rather than statesmanship, especially when fear is demanding certainty. Compared to Elizabeth I's tighter control of patronage and image, James's court often feels like a household where the head of the family keeps handing the keys to whoever flatters him best. And speaking of handing out keys, wait until you see what happens when a king hands out his trust to a single advisor so completely that foreign policy starts to look like an extension of a private friendship. Rank 20, Charles I again, this time with the bad deal instinct. Charles I already earned his ranking for pride that fueled civil war, but he deserves an additional, more intimate critique. His repeated attraction to solutions that sound strong and decisive while quietly shrinking his options. Consider his approach to negotiation. Time and again, Charles treats compromise as temporary. He makes agreements that buy breathing space, then behaves as if the agreement itself was a trick he was forced to perform. That pattern becomes fatal during the Civil War years, when trust is more valuable than cavalry. Even before open conflict, Charles's reliance on narrow counsel, rather than broad political coalition, magnifies suspicion. Policies in religion and finance are pushed with a tone of certainty that leaves opponents no face-saving exit. When a ruler offers no dignified way for rivals to back down, rivals tend to double down. And when Charles finally faces defeat, he still negotiates like a man bargaining from imagined strength. He plays factions against one another, assuming someone will decide he is too useful to lose. It's an almost theatrical misread of the moment. His opponents, exhausted and radicalized by years of bloodshed, stop seeing him as a bargaining chip and start seeing him as the obstacle itself. This isn't stupidity in the sense of ignorance. It's stupidity in the sense of a refusal to learn from repeated evidence. Compared to monarchs who survived by adapting their style under pressure, Charles treats adaptation as surrender. But if that kind of rigidity makes you tired, don't worry. Our next entry is a different flavour entirely. A king who thought he could buy political control the way you buy furniture, then acted shocked when the room didn't stay arranged. Rank 19. Henry VIII, and the one more marriage will fix it, theory. Henry VIII begins his reign in 1509 as a golden prince, athletic, charming, and eager to be admired as a Renaissance king. The trouble is that Henry's self-image becomes the engine of policy, and policy becomes the servant of desire. His greatest strategic mistake isn't simply breaking with Rome. That act had complex causes and broad consequences. The mistake is the way he personalizes every institution he touches. When he wants an annulment from Catherine of Aragon and doesn't get it quickly, he doesn't merely seek alternatives. He tears the legal and religious fabric of the realm until it produces the outcome he wants. The result is monumental. The English Reformation accelerates. Monastic wealth is dissolved and redistributed, and political loyalty becomes entangled with religious conformity. Henry gains power in the short term, but he also creates a kingdom where faith and allegiance are permanently volatile. Then comes the domestic chaos, multiple marriages with succession anxiety at the centre. Executions of queens and courtiers turn the court into a place where survival depends on reading Henry's moods like weather. The message to everyone is clear. Stability is conditional, and conditional stability breeds fear. Comparatively, monarchs who needed heirs often worked through broad dynastic alliances with minimal disruption. Henry treats marriage as both romance and statecraft, then punishes the state when romance fails. He gets his son, Edward VI, but the succession still becomes a crisis. His long-term legacy includes a kingdom primed for whiplash between religious regimes. And speaking of whiplash, let's move to a monarch whose rule proves that sometimes the stupid choice is not dramatic tyranny, but the quiet confidence that everyone will eventually agree with you if you just keep insisting. Rank 18, Victoria, and the isolation that made the monarchy look absent. Queen Victoria's intelligence and endurance are not in question. Her reign is vast, and her symbolic power is enormous, but she makes a prolonged, emotionally driven political miscalculation after Prince Albert's death in December 1861. She retreats from public life so extensively that the monarchy begins to feel less like a national institution and more like a private grief behind closed doors. Victorians understood mourning, but the scale and duration of her withdrawal collide with a changing public sphere, expanding newspapers, a louder political culture, a country that expects visibility from its symbols. Contemporary criticism grows. Republican sentiment, a once marginal, gets oxygen because the crown looks distant at the very moment the public is learning to demand accountability from everything else. Her seclusion also changes the internal balance of influence. Advisors, household figures, and private confidants can loom larger when the sovereign is less publicly engaged. The monarchy's image becomes easier for critics to caricature as expensive and irrelevant. Comparatively, rulers who survive modernization tend to do so by leaning into ritual and public presence, becoming a kind of national mirror. Victoria eventually returns more actively to public duty, and later jubilees restore her popularity. But the misread remains instructive. She assumed the institution could run on reverence alone. Sometimes it can, but not for long. And speaking of institutions struggling to keep up, our next entry is a royal who didn't misread grief, but misread the entire empire, treating it as a permanent possession rather than a negotiated reality. Rank 17, George III and the American Impossibility. He would not accept George III is often simplified into a villain in the American Revolution story, but the reality is messier. Ministers, parliament, imperial administrators, and colonial elites all play roles. Still, George becomes the symbolic anchor of a strategy that increasingly confuses stubbornness for strength. After the 7 Years' War ends in 1763, Britain's empire is larger and more expensive to administer. The government seeks revenue from the American colonies through measures like the Stamp Act and later taxes. Colonists resist, arguing about representation, rights, and constitutional principle. The conflict becomes not just financial but ideological. George's stupid contribution is not a single policy memo. It's the sustained belief that imperial authority can be asserted without conceding meaningful political voice, and that escalation will eventually produce submission rather than rupture. As crisis deepens, opportunities for compromise exist in theory, but political trust collapses. By 1775, war begins. By 1776, independence is declared. Britain fights for years, spending treasure and blood, and loses a vast portion of its American empire by the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Comparatively, empires that endure learn to bargain with distance, to offer autonomy as a price for loyalty. George's Britain chooses discipline over negotiation, and then discovers that discipline across an ocean is expensive and sometimes impossible. If you think that's a lesson monarchs would remember, brace yourself, because up next is a royal who mistakes personal honour for national interest and turns diplomacy into a duel. Rank 16, Edward III and the claim that turned into a century. Edward III is one of England's most capable medieval kings in many respects. Militarily ambitious, politically astute, personally charismatic. which is why his strategic gamble becomes so consequential. His claim to the French throne, pressed in the late 1330s, helps ignite what later historians call the Hundred Years' War. The claim has legal and dynastic arguments behind it, but it is also a tool, an excuse for leverage, territory, prestige, and frankly, in a king's desire to be seen as the rightful hero of a continental drama. In 1337, conflict escalates. Campaigns follow, including the famous victories at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. In the short term, England enjoys glory and captured kings. In the long term, England inherits a grinding, multi-generational war that reshapes taxation, governance, and the relationship between crown and nobility. It fuels militarization and periodic national crisis, and it plants seeds of later instability when victories prove difficult to consolidate. Comparatively, rulers who build durable power often choose conflicts with clear, achievable ends. Edward chooses a conflict with shifting goals, vast costs, and a timeline no human being can manage from start to finish. He doesn't create every disaster that follows, but he opens the door and steps through it with confidence. And speaking of confidence, our next entry is a royal who thought image was power, and power was something you could stage manage like a pageant, even while the nation's real politics were sharpening knives behind the curtain. Rank 15. Richard III and the speed run to distrust. Richard III reigns for just over 2 years, from 1483 to 1485, and those years are so saturated with suspicion that his story becomes a kind of historical ink blot. The core issue is not simply what he did, but how quickly he allowed events to look like the worst possible version of themselves. Richard becomes protector for his young nephew, Edward V, after Edward IV's death in April 1483. Within months, Edward V is declared illegitimate. Richard takes the crown. He and the two princes are lodged in the Tower of London, then vanish from public view. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains disputed in details and evidence, but politically, the damage is immediate. A cloud of suspicion settles over Richard's legitimacy like soot. Even if he believed his actions were necessary, he failed to understand that monarchy runs on perception as much as law. Rebellions follow, most notably Buckingham's rebellion in late 1483. Richard's support becomes brittle. When Henry Tudor lands in 1485, the country is primed to accept change, and Richard's image cannot withstand the pressure. At Bosworth on 22nd August 1485, Richard is killed, and the Tudor dynasty begins. Comparatively, rulers who seize power successfully do it either with overwhelming legitimacy or overwhelming force. Richard tries to do it with a legal argument that the public doesn't emotionally buy, while the most damaging rumours remain unanswered. He doesn't just lose, he leaves behind a controversy so potent it becomes myth. Rank 14. George II and the family war that became government. George II is often remembered as a competent enough constitutional monarch who let ministers run the country, which is exactly why his most self-defeating habit stands out. He turned his own household into a permanent opposition party. His feud with his son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, wasn't private bickering. It was public, performative, and politically useful to anyone who wanted leverage. Frederick built a rival court, drawing in disgruntled politicians, poets, and patrons who understood that being close to the heir could be a career strategy. That meant George's enemies didn't need to invent an alternative power centre. The king's family did it for them, with matching silverware. The stupidity here is structural. In a monarchy that increasingly survived by projecting stability, George repeatedly advertised instability at the most intimate level, where symbolism hurts most. He could have managed the heir with controlled access, carefully balanced patronage, and an agreed public script. Instead, he allowed personal dislike to harden into a national spectacle. When a king's home becomes a political arena, governance becomes reactive. Every decision is filtered through, who does this help at court, rather than what does this do to the country? And speaking of royal households that detonated politics, let's visit a queen whose friendships didn't just sour, they rerouted the state. The rank 13, Anne, and the friendship that broke the ministry. Queen Anne begins her reign in 1702 carrying a burden that never stops pressing. Fragile health, grief from repeated pregnancies that do not produce a surviving heir, and a political world split into rival parties that treat the crown like a prize to be steered. Anne's most damaging miscalculation is how personally she conducts what is, in effect, a party management job. Her relationship with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, is intimate and influential, until it isn't. As the friendship fractures, Anne's court becomes a pressure cooker where affection and policy are fused together in a way that invites manipulation. Enter Abigail Masham, a quieter figure who gains the Queen's trust. The shift in Anne's personal circle coincides with a broader political turn, contributing to the fall of one ministerial arrangement and the rise of another. The War of the Spanish Succession, taxation, patronage, and diplomatic aims all tangle with the emotional weather inside the Queen's rooms. This is not stupid like a drunken gamble. It's a subtler royal error, treating private loyalty as if it's a safe compass for public governance. Ministers rise and fall not solely because of parliamentary arithmetic, but because the monarch's heart is repositioned, and the most brutal irony is the end. Anne dies in 1714 without a surviving child, and the succession passes to the House of Hanover under the existing settlement, meaning the personal storms did not even secure the family future she so desperately needed. Meanwhile, 1 century earlier, another monarch seizes a crown fast, so fast it slips through his fingers. A rank 12, Stephen and the crown taken too fast. When Henry I dies in December 1135, England faces a clear test. Will oaths and planned succession matter, or will speed and muscle decide? Stephen of Blois chooses speed. He moves quickly, secures support, and takes the crown, despite the fact that Henry I had made leading men swear to accept his daughter, the Empress Matilda, as heir. Stephen likely believes that once he is crowned, reality will solidify around him. That's the fatal misunderstanding. A contested crown doesn't become uncontested just because you're sitting on it. Stephen's reign is marked by what contemporaries later describe as disorder. Barons building unauthorized castles, local power hardening into private rule, loyalties changing with opportunity. Whether every anarchy story is equally accurate is debated, but the broad pattern is clear. Stephen never fully stabilizes the realm. The stupidity is strategic. If you seize power, you must compensate with competence. Stephen instead spends years juggling crises, losing and regaining advantage, and failing to create a settlement everyone can live with. The result is prolonged civil war, real suffering, and a monarchy that looks weaker precisely because it tried to be stronger. In the end, the succession settles on Matilda's son, Henry II, a tacit admission that Stephen's grab solved nothing. And speaking of grabs that backfire, let's look at a king who didn't seize a crown, but seized the idea that words are harmless. Rank 11, Henry II, and the sentence that couldn't be unsaid. Henry II is, in many ways, the opposite of a weak monarch. He is energetic, administrative, and relentless, building legal machinery and projecting authority across a wide Angevin realm, which makes his most infamous blunder feel almost absurd in its simplicity. In 1170, conflict with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, reaches a boiling point. Becket is not merely a cleric, he's a political symbol of whether church authority can resist royal power. Henry fumes. Chroniclers preserve a version of Henry's outburst, often paraphrased as a furious question about whether no one will rid him of this troublesome priest. The exact wording is debated, and historians are careful about treating it as verbatim. But the outcome is not debated. 4 knights take Henry's anger as permission. On 29th of December 1170, they kill Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. And this is stupid in the most royal way. the assumption that your private venting will remain private, and that your subordinates will interpret rage as theatre rather than instruction. Henry spends years doing penance and managing the political fallout. Becket becomes a martyr and a saint. The crown's moral authority is bruised, and the church gains a powerful symbol that will outlive Henry's administrative victories. If Henry's goal was dominance, the murder produces the opposite. A lasting spiritual indictment stamped onto the story of royal power. And speaking of royal gambles with long aftershocks, prepare for a battlefield decision that turns a kingdom into a nursery. Rank 10. James IV and Flodden's perfectly avoidable gamble. In 1513, James IV of Scotland makes a choice that looks bold in the short term and catastrophic in the long term. He invades England, honouring an alliance obligation to France while Henry VIII is campaigning abroad. The political logic exists, so does the problem. James is risking everything: his own life, the stability of the Scottish crown, and the continuity of government, on a battle that does not need to be personally led by the king in the way medieval honour culture romanticizes. At Flodden on the 9th of September 1513, the Scots suffer a devastating defeat. James IV is killed, along with a large portion of Scotland's nobility. The result is a familiar royal disaster: a dead king, an underage successor, and a power vacuum filled by factions. James leaves behind James V, an infant. Scotland enters years of regency politics where power is contested. The alliances shift, and the country's internal wounds widen. The monarchy becomes vulnerable to influence precisely when steadiness is most needed. Comparatively, successful rulers often treat war as a tool, not a personal identity. James treats war as a stage on which kings prove themselves. Flodden proves something else: that courage can be indistinguishable from national self-harm when the crown is strapped to a single body. And speaking of crowns strapped to fragile bodies, our next entry is a king who wanted to enjoy his restoration so much that he left a trap for everyone who came after. Rank 9. Charles II and the Succession. Time bomb. Charles II returns to the throne in 1660 with a nation exhausted by revolution, regicide, and experiment. His great political gift is survival. He reads people, manages moods, and makes monarchy feel livable again, which is why his biggest strategic failure is so damning, because it's not a lack of intelligence, but a refusal to resolve the obvious problem sitting in the line of succession. Charles has no legitimate heirs. His brother and heir, James, is openly Catholic in a kingdom where Catholicism is politically explosive. Rather than secure a broadly acceptable settlement, Charles tries to ride out the tension through balancing act, tolerating ambiguity, managing Parliament, and using his own personal charm to keep the system from demanding a final answer. During the Exclusion Crisis, late 1670s into 1681, factions attempt to block James from inheriting. Charles resists, dissolves parliaments, and uses the tools available to him to keep the succession intact. In the short term, he wins. In the long term, he ensures that the crown passes to the one man most likely to reign in a way that triggers upheaval. James II takes the throne in 1685, and within 3 years the Glorious Revolution removes him. The monarchy survives, but on new terms, more explicitly constitutional, more constrained, and shaped by the memory of what happens when rulers ignore political reality. Charles II wanted to avoid conflict. By postponing the hard decision, he guaranteed a bigger one for his successors. We're now entering the upper tier, where the stupid choices don't just embarrass a reign, they bend the timeline. Rank 8. Harold Godwinson, and the week his army couldn't survive in 1066. Harold Godwinson becomes king in January, and by October he is dead on a battlefield, replaced by a conquest that rewires England for generations. It's tempting to tell the story like fate, but the part that stings is the logistics, the brutally human, footsore, hungry logistics. In September, Harold races north to meet the Norwegian invasion, led by Harald Hardrada, with his own exiled brother Tostig attached like a personal curse. Harold wins at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066, a hard-fought victory that should have been the end of the crisis. Then the real disaster arrives. William of Normandy lands in the south, and Harold force-marches his army back down the spine of England, rushing towards the second invasion like a man trying to juggle knives while running. His decision to fight at Hastings on October 14th, rather than delay, gather more forces, or choose terrain and timing more carefully, locks the kingdom into a single exhausted wager. The English line fights fiercely, but exhaustion and tactical pressure do their work. Harold dies, and with him dies the last real chance to stop a new ruling class from taking root. A king's job isn't only courage, it's tempo. Harold plays the tempo like a drum that cracks mid-song, and England pays for it in language, landholding, and law. And speaking of kings who left the realm exposed, not to an army, but to uncertainty itself, let's rewind to the royal vacuum that made 1066 possible. Rank 7. Edward the Confessor and the Succession. He never finished Edward the Confessor rules for decades, yet his most consequential act is what he doesn't do. He fails to lock down the succession with a clarity strong enough to survive his death. Edward dies on the 5th of January 1066, childless. That fact alone doesn't doom a kingdom. What dooms a kingdom is when a childless king allows multiple serious claimants to believe they have a legitimate path to the throne. In the years leading up to his death, the political world swirls with competing narratives. Harold's rise, William of Normandy's asserted promises, and the lingering claim of Edgar the Etheling, whose bloodline is right in a way politics rarely respects. Edward's court is not ignorant of the stakes. England is wealthy, strategically valuable, and exposed. A contested succession invites foreign interest the way fresh bread invites a hungry crowd, yet Edward seems to drift in that dangerous space where piety, preference, and procrastination masquerade as neutrality. If he intended Harold to succeed, the broader settlement needed reinforcement. If he intended a foreign claimant, the domestic groundwork was essential. If he intended a compromise, he never secured it. The result is a succession crisis that does not remain a legal argument. It becomes 2 invasions in 1 year, a forced march, and a battlefield verdict. Edward's stupid legacy is not stupidity of mind, it's stupidity of avoidance, treating the future as something that will politely wait until you're ready to decide. And speaking of kings who thought problems could be postponed, let's visit a ruler who tried to solve family politics by handing out pieces of power like party favours, then acted shocked when his sons treated it like a map to civil war. Rank 6. Henry II, and the family plan that became a rebellion engine. Henry II is often praised as an administrator, a legal reformer, a builder of royal machinery, which makes his domestic strategy feel like an expensive lapse in basic human forecasting. He attempts to manage succession and control by granting titles and roles to his sons without surrendering real authority, creating princes with expectations, pride, and armies of supporters, but not enough actual power to satisfy them. The setup is almost a textbook warning. Henry's sons, Henry the Young King, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, grow up in a court where their father is relentless and dominant. He crowns the young king in 1170, a gesture meant to stabilize succession, but keeps the substance of rule in his own hand. It is monarchy by teaser trailer. By 1173 to 1174, the pressure erupts into open rebellion, fueled not only by the son's frustrations but by baronial opportunism and foreign involvement. The rebellion fails, as yet the family conflict never truly ends. Richard later fights Henry. John plots. Alliances shift like weather. Henry is forced into repeated cycles of negotiation, punishment, and uneasy reconciliation. The stupidity is strategic. Henry creates multiple centers of ambition inside his own dynasty and assumes he can regulate them indefinitely through personal dominance. But dominance doesn't scale. The moment a king ages, falters, or is distracted, the system he built becomes a machine for internal conflict. Henry II spends his final years besieged by the very heirs he worked so hard to produce. Remember Harold's tempo problem? Henry's mistake is tempo too. He starts the succession drama early, then tries to keep it permanently unresolved. Meanwhile, another king will chase a grand, glorious endgame abroad, then die too soon. By leaving England holding a contract with history it can't pay. Rank 5, Henry V, and the victory that left a child holding the bill. Henry V is the kind of monarch historians and filmmakers love. Disciplined, martial, charismatic in a hard-edged way, and capable of turning war into national myth. He wins at Agincourt in 1415 and his reputation grows into legend. The stupid part is not that he fought, it's that he pursued an endgame so ambitious that it depended on him personally surviving long enough to enforce it. By the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, Henry is recognized as heir to the French throne and regent of France, marrying Catherine of Valois and positioning himself as the future ruler of a dual monarchy. On paper, it's dynastic genius. In reality, it's a structure balanced on one human spine. France is not a passive prize, and it's a fractured political landscape with loyalists, rivals, and a national identity that will not remain quiet. Henry dies suddenly on 31st August 1422, only weeks before the French king Charles VI. The inheritance becomes a nightmare. An infant, Henry VI, is now the legal linchpin of an enormous claim that requires adult authority, sustained military success, and political cohesion across two kingdoms. Instead, England gets regency politics, factional rivalry, growing resistance in France, and eventually the humiliating unravelling of English control. The long-term cost feeds directly into instability at home, contributing to the atmosphere in which the Wars of the Roses later ignite. Henry V wins a stunning battle and secures a stunning treaty, then leaves the realm a toddler and a demand note from history. And if you think that's the worst kind of short-term triumph, wait until we reach the top ranks, where monarchs don't just leave problems, they manufacture them. Rank 4, Henry III and the Sicily will totally pay for itself. Fantasy. Henry III spends so much of his reign treating England like a private household budget that he forgets the kingdom can in fact say no, loudly. He inherits the throne as a child in 1216 and grows into an adult king who loves art, ceremony, and grand plan. The problem is his relationship with money and persuasion. He assumes if he wants something badly enough, the realm will eventually finance it out of habit. The clearest example is his Sicilian obsession in the 1250s. The papacy, entangled in its own power struggles, offers Henry the chance to secure the Kingdom of Sicily for his younger son, Edmund. It's a continental prize with a continental price tag, and Henry reacts like a man seeing a luxury property brochure. He accepts. Then the invoices arrive. The papacy expects vast sums, and Henry tries to raise them through taxation and pressure on a political class that is already tired of his spending, his foreign favourites, and his habit of promising more than he can deliver. What makes this stupid isn't that international strategy is inherently foolish. It's that Henry commits to an expensive foreign crown without the domestic consensus required to pay for it, and without any realistic mechanism to enforce the deal. The predictable result is domestic rebellion dressed as reform. In 1258, baronial opposition forces Henry into the provisions of Oxford, a dramatic attempt to limit royal misrule through councils and oversight. Henry spends years trying to wriggle out of constraints he helped create by making himself untrustworthy. That tension escalates into the Second Barons' War, with Simon de Montfort briefly dominating governance after the Battle of Lewes in 1264. Henry survives, but the monarchy is battered into a new relationship with accountability. Compared to kings who made foreign policy serve the realm, Henry makes the realm serve his daydream, then acts offended when the bill turns into a constitution fight. And speaking of royals who treated dangerous toys like proof of greatness, Our next entry literally dies for the thrill of modern firepower. Rank 3. James II of Scotland and the canon that didn't care he was king. James II of Scotland rules in the mid-15th century, an era when kings are still expected to lead from the front. I intimidate magnates and prove they are more dangerous than their rivals. James does that. He's energetic, forceful, and determined to break the power of overmighty nobles. But he also lives in the age of artillery, new weapons that promise decisive siege victories and make medieval walls feel suddenly fragile. Cannons become status symbols as much as tools, and James seems to relish them like a man who thinks technology is the same thing as destiny. In 1460, during the siege of Roxburgh Castle, James positions himself close enough to his artillery to watch it work. Contemporary accounts describe a catastrophic accident. A cannon explodes, and the king is killed. The exact mechanics are reconstructed from chroniclers rather than modern forensic reports, so details can blur. But the core is consistently remembered because it is so blunt. The king dies by standing too near the violent machine he wanted to personally supervise. This isn't a heroic death charging a line. It's a workplace safety fatality with a crown on, and the consequences are exactly what you'd expect when a king dies abruptly in a high-stakes political environment. His heir, James III, is a child. Scotland falls into a regency situation where rival interests compete for influence. The crown's authority becomes something factions fight over rather than something the monarch actively enforces. Comparatively, sensible rulers treat new weapons with respect, delegating the dangerous practicalities to specialists while keeping their own bodies intact. James treats the cannon like an extension of his will. The cannon treats him like a bag of meat. And speaking of bags of meat, let's move to his son, who manages to survive childhood regency only to be undone by the court politics he never truly learned to navigate. Rank 2. James III of Scotland and the court that turned into a coup. James III inherits the Scottish throne as a child after his father's cannon mishap and grows up in a political landscape that rewards hard realism. Keep nobles divided, reward loyalty carefully, punish betrayal decisively, and never let anyone believe the king is replaceable. James does almost the opposite. He is drawn to art, architecture, and the company of favourites who are not from the highest noble strata. In another context, that might look like merit. In Scotland's 15th century politics, it looks like provocation. The powerful families who expect access and influence begin to see James's inner circle as an insult. Men elevated not by lineage, but by closeness. James's handling of his own brothers deepens instability. Rivalries within the royal family become political magnets for discontent, because any alternative prince can become a banner for opposition. Add financial strain, foreign policy anxieties, and a nobility accustomed to direct leverage, and you get a reign that feels like a long argument with swords quietly being sharpened off stage. By 1488, rebellion is open. The crisis culminates at the Battle of Sarchiburn, near Stirling in June 1488. James's forces fail and he flees. Then comes the murky end. James dies shortly after, and accounts differ on how. Some narratives describe murder after he sought refuge. Others present a confused aftermath. What matters politically is that his reign ends with a violent transfer of power, and a young successor, James IV, crowned under the shadow of rebellion. Here's why this is stupid, rather than merely unfortunate. James III behaves as if personal preference is an adequate substitute for coalition building. He treats the nobility's expectations as something he can ignore without consequence. In a kingdom where nobles don't just complain, they physically replace you. Comparatively, monarchs who survive turbulent elites either dominate them with force or absorb them with patronage. James antagonizes them while also looking to his enemies insufficiently formidable. If you are going to be disliked, you need to be feared. James is neither enough. And speaking of royals who insisted on playing treason like it was a hobby, Our number one is not a king. He's the kind of royal who makes you understand why courts invented dungeons. Rank 1, George, Duke of Clarence, and the I'll convince them this time. Delusion. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, is the brother of Edward IV and, briefly, the sort of man who believes proximity to a crown means you can commit unlimited mistakes without running out of chances. His life is a masterclass in the royal form of self-sabotage. Repeated betrayal paired with repeated confidence that this betrayal will be the one everyone forgives. During the Wars of the Roses, Clarence shifts loyalties in ways that make him look less like a strategist and more like a weather vane in a storm. He aligns, he defects, he plots, he returns, he expects restoration. The pattern is the point. He treats power like a family argument rather than a lethal political environment. He also marries into influence, Isabel Neville, daughter of the powerful kingmaker Warwick, and becomes entangled in the kind of factional politics that can either elevate a prince or turn him into a cautionary tale. Clarence chooses the cautionary tale route repeatedly. He quarrels with his brother, clashes over inheritances and influence, and behaves as if royal blood is a permanent legal shield against the obvious conclusion. Eventually, the king stops trusting you. By 1478, Clarence is arrested and condemned for treason. The famous story claims he was executed by being drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. Historians treat the specific method as uncertain. Sensational details travel well through time, and courts don't always publish neat execution memos. But the fact of his execution is solid. Whether he died by wine or by a more ordinary means, the symbolism sticks because it fits his personality. A royal who lived like consequences were a rumour, taken out by a story that sounds like a dark joke. The stupidity here is almost pure. Many royals scheme once and either win or lose. Clarence schemes repeatedly and acts shocked when repetition stops being a misunderstanding and becomes a pattern. Comparatively, survival in royal politics often comes from two skills: loyalty or the convincing performance of it. Clarence can't manage either for long. He treats the throne like a family heirloom he can tug toward himself whenever he feels overlooked. He tugs until the rope snaps, and now, with the rankings complete, the sleepy question is unavoidable. Why do royals keep making the same category of mistake, century after century, as if the palace walls erase memory? So when people ask, half laughing, why history's royals did so many stupid things, the answer is rarely that they were uniquely foolish. It's that monarchy is a machine designed to trap a human being inside a myth, then demand human decisions from inside that myth. Some rulers made stupid choices because they were reckless. Harold betting an exhausted army against an invasion, James IV wagering his kingdom on one battle, James II of Scotland trusting a cannon more than caution. Others were undone by arrogance. Charles I treating compromise like contamination. James II of England assuming royal prerogative could bulldoze fear. Richard II turning revenge into governance and acting shocked when the realm treated him as replaceable. Some were victims of their own indulgence. George IV, spending like the national treasury, was a personal bloodstream. James I handing power to favourites as if flattery were a qualification. Henry III signing up for a Sicilian fantasy and then staring at the invoice like it was rude. And then there are the royals whose stupidity is almost poetic in its repetition. Edward VIII mistaking a constitutional monarchy for a stage, Clarence mistaking forgiveness for an infinite resource, Edward the Confessor leaving a succession unresolved, as if the future were polite enough to wait. If there's a comfort in any of this, it's a quiet one. These aren't random disasters, they're patterns. When power is insulated, it warps judgment. When institutions rely on a single person's temperament, they inherit that person's weaknesses. And when a society stops being willing to say no, it eventually has to say something much harsher. So the next time you hear a royal story that sounds unbelievable, an avoidable war, a sudden deposition, a scandal that becomes policy. Listen for the familiar mechanisms underneath. Desire pretending to be destiny, speed pretending to be legitimacy, certainty pretending to be wisdom. History doesn't repeat because people are cursed. It repeats because systems reward the same mistakes until the cost becomes too obvious to ignore. If you want more long, calm documentaries that let the uncomfortable details unfold at bedtime, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me what part of British history you want next. And for now, let the palace doors close softly in your mind. Let the arguments fade into the distance, and let the silence finally win.